Today we're going to read chapter 16 of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. The title is Vita-Wonk and Minus Land. "It's up to you, Charlie, my boy," said Mr. Wonka. "It's your factory. Shall we let your Grandma Georgina wait it out for the next 2 years, or shall we try to bring her back right now?" "You don't really mean you might be able to bring her back?" cried Charlie. "There's no harm in trying, is there? If that's the way you want it?" "Oh, yes, of course I do, for Mother's sake especially. Can't you see how sad she is?" Mrs. Bucket was sitting on the edge of the big bed, dabbing her eyes with a hanky. "My poor old Mum," she kept saying. "She's -2 and I won't see her again for months and months and months, if ever at all." Behind her, Grandpa Joe, with the help of an Oompa Loompa, was feeding his 3-month-old wife, Grandma Josephine, from a bottle. Alongside them, Mr. Bucket was spooning something called Wonka's Squudgemellow baby food into 1-year-old Grandpa George's mouth, but mostly all over his chin and chest. "Big deal," he was muttering angrily. "What a lousy, rotten this is. They tell me I'm going to a chocolate factory to have a good time, and I finish up being a mother to my father-in-law." "Everything's under control, Charlie," said Mr. Wonka, surveying the scene. "They're doing fine. They don't need us here. Come along. We're off to hunt for Grandma." He caught Charlie by the arm and was dancing towards the open door of the great glass elevator. "Hurry up, my dear boy, hurry up," he cried. "We've got to hustle if we're going to get there before." "Before what, Mr. Wonka?" "Before she gets subtracted, of course. All minuses are subtracted. Don't you know any arithmetic at all?" They were in the elevator now, and Mr. Wonka was searching among the hundreds of buttons for the one he wanted. "Here we are," he said, placing his finger delicately upon a tiny ivory button on which it said Minus Land. The door slid shut, and then, with a fearful, whistling, whirring sound, the great machine leapt away to the right. Charlie grabbed Mr. Wonka's legs and held on for dear life. Mr. Wonka pulled a jump seat out of the wall and said, "Sit down, Charlie, quick, and strap yourself in tight. This journey's going to be rough and choppy." There were straps on either side of the seat, and Charlie buckled himself firmly in. Mr. Wonka pulled out a second seat for himself and did the same. "We are going a long way down," he said. "Oh, such a long way down we are going." The elevator was gathering speed. It twisted and swerved. It swung sharply to the left, and then it went to the right, then left again, and it was heading downward all the time. Down, down, down. "I only hope," said Mr. Wonka, "that the Oompa Loompas aren't using the other elevator today." "What other elevator?" asked Charlie. "The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this." "Holy snakes, Mr. Wonka, you mean we might have a collision?" "I've always been lucky so far, my boy." "Hey! Take a look out there, quick!" Through the window, Charlie caught a glimpse of what seemed to be an enormous quarry with a steep, craggy brown rock face, and all over the rock face there were hundreds of Oompa Loompas working with picks and pneumatic drills. "Rock candy," said Mr. Wonka. "That's the richest deposit of rock candy in the world." The elevator sped on. "We're going deeper, Charlie, deeper and deeper. We're about 200,000 feet down already." Strange sights were flashing by outside, but the elevator was traveling at such a terrific speed that only occasionally was Charlie able to recognize anything at all. Once he thought he saw in the distance a cluster of tiny houses shaped like upside-down cups, and there were streets in between the houses and Oompa Loompas walking in the streets. Another time, as they were passing some sort of vast red plain dotted with things that looked like oil derricks, he saw a great spout of brown liquid squirting out of the ground high in the air. "A gusher!" cried Mr. Wonka, slapping his hands. "A whacking great gusher! How splendid! Just when we needed it." "Oh, what?" said Charlie. "We've struck chocolate again, my boy. That'll be a rich new field. Oh, what a beautiful gusher. Just look at it go." On they roared, heading downward more steeply than ever now, and hundreds, literally hundreds of astonishing sights kept flashing by outside. There were giant cogwheels turning, and mixers mixing, and bubbles bubbling, and vast orchards of toffee apple trees, and lakes the size of football fields filled with blue and gold and green liquid. And everywhere there were Oompa Loompas. "You realize," said Mr. Wonka, "that what you saw earlier on when you went round the factory with all those naughty little children was only a tiny corner of the establishment. It goes down for miles and miles, and as soon as possible I shall show you all the way around, slowly and properly. Right now we have other things to think about, and I have important things to tell you. Listen carefully to me, Charlie. I must talk fast, for we'll be there in a couple of minutes. I suppose you guess, Mr. Wonka went on, what happened to all those Oompa Loompas in the testing room when I was experimenting with Wonkavite. Of course you did. They disappeared and became minuses just like your Grandma Georgina. The recipe was miles too strong. One of them actually became minus 87. Imagine that. You mean he's got to wait 87 years before he can come back? Charlie asked. That's what kept bugging me, my boy. After all, one can't allow one's best friends to wait around as miserable minuses for 87 years. And get subtracted as well, said Charlie. That would be frightful. Of course it would, Charlie. So what did I do? Willy Wonka, I said to myself. If you can invent Wonkavite to make people younger, then surely to goodness you can also invent something else to make people older. Aha! Cried Charlie. I see what you're getting at. Then you could turn the minuses quickly back into pluses and bring them home again. Precisely, my dear boy. Precisely. Always supposing, of course, that I could find out where the minuses had gone to. The elevator plunged on, diving steeply toward the center of the earth. All was blackness outside now. There was nothing to be seen. So once again, Mr. Wonka went on. I rolled up my sleeves and I set to work. Once again, I squeezed my brain searching for the new recipe. I had to create age to make people old. Old, older, oldest. Ha ha! I cried, for now the ideas were beginning to come. What is the oldest living thing in the world? What lives longer than anything else? A tree? Charlie said. Right you are, Charlie. But what kind of tree? Not the Douglas fir, not the oak, not the cedar. No, no, my boy. It is a tree called the bristlecone pine that grows upon the slopes of Wheeler Peak in Nevada, USA. You can find bristlecone pines on Wheeler Peak today that are over 4,000 years old. This is fact, Charlie. Ask any dendrochronologist you like, and look that word up in the dictionary when you get home, will you please? So that started me off. I jumped into the great glass elevator and rushed all over the world collecting special items from the oldest living things. A pint of sap from a 4,000-year-old bristlecone pine, the toenail clippings from a 160-year-old Russian farmer called Petrovich Grigorovich, an egg laid by a 200-year-old tortoise belonging to the King of Tonga, the tail of a 51-year-old horse in Arabia, the whiskers of a 36-year-old cat called Crumpets, an old flea which had lived on crumpets for 36 years, the tail of a 207-year-old giant rat from Tibet, the black teeth of a 97-year-old Grimalkin living in a cave on Mount Popocatépetl, and the knuckle bones of a 700-year-old Cataloo from Peru. All over the world, Charlie, I tracked down every old and ancient animal and took an important little bit of something from each one of them. A hair or an eyebrow, or sometimes it was no more than an ounce or two of the jam scraped from between its toes while it was sleeping. I tracked down the whistle pig, the bobolink, the skronk, the polyfrog, the giant curlicue, the stinging slug, and the venomous squircle, who can spit poison right into your eye from 50 yards away. But there's no time to tell you about all of them now, Charlie. Let me just say quickly that in the end, after lots of boiling and bubbling and mixing and testing in my inventing room, I produced one tiny capful of oily black liquid and gave 4 drops of it to a brave 20-year-old Oompa Loompa volunteer to see what happened. What happened? Charlie asked. It was fantastic, cried Mr. Wonka. The moment he swallowed it, he began wrinkling and shriveling up all over, and his hair started dropping off, and his teeth started falling out, and before I knew it, he had suddenly become an old fellow of 75. And thus, my dear Charlie, was Vita-Wonk invented. Did you rescue all the Oompa Loompa minuses, Mr. Wonka? Every single one of them, my boy. 131 all told. Mind you, it wasn't quite as easy as all that. There were lots of snags and complications along the way. Good heavens. We're nearly there. I must stop talking now and watch where we're going. Charlie realized that the elevator was no longer rushing and roaring. It was hardly moving at all now. It seemed to be drifting. Undo your straps, Mr. Wonka said. We must get ready for action. Charlie undid his straps and stood up and peered out. It was an eerie sight. They were drifting in a heavy gray mist, and the mist was swirling and swishing around them as though driven by winds from many sides. In the distance, the mist was darker and almost black, and it seemed to be swirling more fiercely than ever over there. Mr. Wonka slid open the doors. "Stand back!" he said. "Don't fall out, Charlie, whatever you do!" The mist came into the elevator. It had the fusty, reeky smell of an old underground dungeon. The silence was overpowering. There was no sound at all. No whisper of wind, no voice of creature or insect, and it gave Charlie a queer frightening feeling to be standing there in the middle of this gray, inhuman nothingness, as though he were in another world altogether, in some place where man should never be. Minus land, Mr. Wonka whispered. "This is it, Charlie. The problem now is to find her. We may be lucky, and then again, we may not."